This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew, an editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very, very warm welcome to an Indiana Jones themed episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, title gives it away, really. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, behind-the-scenes stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. The films that I'm covering have more of a mainstream leaning than anything else. They're films I'm particularly invested in or interested in to some degree as well. And in the case of this episode, well, I do two films an episode. I really like the two I'm going to talk about this time round. I think I've given away what one of them is. I've probably given away what both of them are if you've read the actual file name of this podcast. But, you know, I'll try and keep up the pretense a little bit. Let's go back to 1989. I'm going to play you a clip from a trailer. We'll do the story the other side of this.
Holy Grail.
How dare you kiss me?
Are you crazy? Don't go between them!
Go between them, are you crazy?
Where's my father?
In the belly of that steel beast. Dad! Junior!
You call this archaeology? The quest for the Grail is not archaeology. It's a race against evil.
Germany has declared war on the Jones boys.
Those people are trying to kill us.
I know, Dad!
It's a new experience for me.
Happens to me all the time.
Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Have the adventure of your life, keeping up with the Joneses.
We're back, as you might have guessed, in the world of Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, that was from, which they've just told you, dates back to 1989, directed by Steven Spielberg, screenplay in the end credited to Jeffrey Boam, with story from George Lucas and Menno Meyers. The cast of this one, Harrison Ford returning in the title role alongside Denham Elliott, Alison Doody, John Rhys-Davies, Julian Glover, and of course the late Sean Connery. Well, the story of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade inevitably goes back to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, that had come out in 1984, had been a big success, a big hit, but it had also been made in a dark period of its creators' lives. That I've covered this on a previous episode of Film Stories. Both director Steven Spielberg and producer George Lucas, and Lucas it was who come up with Indiana Jones in the first place, they were going through divorce at the time, and they were both conscious of how dark the resultant film had turned out ultimately to be. They knew that to do a third Indiana Jones film, they would need to go a bit lighter. And in fact, Spielberg goes quite far in an interview he did with Premiere magazine in 1989, where he says there's not an ounce of my own personal feeling in Temple of Doom. Now, I quite like Temple of Doom, but that was generally the narrative that was going around. I think it's had a little bit more redemption since. But the crucial point was, as he headed into the mid-1980s, Spielberg simply wasn't keen to do another. His Amblin Entertainment production company was ramping up, and so he would be supervising movies there before ultimately handing over the reins, the day-to-day reins of that, and he would be off doing films like The Colour Purple and Empire of the Sun. In fact, Lucas too, he went off to develop other projects too. Once Indiana Jones 2 was out, he would be producing and overseeing the likes of Labyrinth, Howard the Duck, I've covered that before, and Willow. And Spielberg made that venture into what was seen as more serious movies. But in the background, there was always development going on Indiana Jones 3. And Spielberg would reconcile that he had two reasons, ultimately, to make another Indiana Jones adventure. Number one was to honour a commitment to George Lucas. And number two was to apologise for the second film. That's his quote. But what would the third film be? Well, this has been quite heavily charted. And in fact, there's a couple of excellent books that I've lent on here. One of which, The Complete Making of Indiana Jones, is as comprehensive as you'd want, really. I hugely recommend it. It's written by J.W. Rinsler. I've also been going through Ian Freer's excellent book on Steven Spielberg. And those two I really do I recommend seeking out. In particular, the huge making of book goes through the many, many different drafts that Indiana Jones 3 went through. So, for instance, there was a leftover idea from Temple of Doom about a haunted house movie, and Diane Thomas, who'd had success penning Romancing the Stone, that's a great film that is, was recruited to pen a script for it. At that point, though, one of the projects that Spielberg had overseen was Poltergeist. In fact, there's a rumour that he did more than just produce that film and stepped in to direct parts of it, a rumour that's been downplayed heavily. Tobe Hooper is the credited director of Poltergeist. But because he'd been through similar material on Poltergeist, he didn't really want to do another, what he saw as a haunted house movie. Then there was, in September of 1984, an outline that George Lucas put together for a future direction for an indie sequel. And this was Indiana Jones and the Monkey King. Lucas penned 8 pages of that outline, and a few ingredients of that actually went forward into what would be the finished film. We would get the return of Marcus Brody, who'd stepped out of Temple of Doom. There'd be a female archaeologist character, the idea of a package in the mail, a German tank in there. Lucas, around this time, was suggesting that the MacGuffin for the movie would be the Holy Grail as well. So the MacGuffin's always been crucial to Lucas in coming up with what the quest in the Indiana Jones films would be. And infamously, it was the search for a MacGuffin that apparently led to the fourth movie taking quite so long to make. I'll come to that right at the end. Spielberg wasn't massively convinced with the idea of a search for the Holy Grail, though. But nonetheless, Lucas pressed ahead and got a screenplay of Indiana Jones and the Monkey King put together by Chris Columbus. Now, at this point, Chris Columbus, he'd had success for Spielberg's Amblin Company with the script for Gremlins. He was working on The Goonies as well. It'd be some while before he was directing himself. 1987's Adventures in Babysitting, and then, of course, 1990's Home Alone was his huge breakthrough as a director. But he delivered his screenplay in May of 1985. It went through a couple of drafts. By August of 1985, it had become Indiana Jones and the Lost City of Sun Wukong. And Columbus also introduced elements that became part of the final movie. So the tank chase was in there. There was a rhino in there. Columbus, though, pushed for an African setting. But as Ian Freer charted in his book, the script, while people were happy with the tone of it, and they felt it got the flavour of Indiana Jones right, they were conscious of accusations of racism that had been levelled at the original indie movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark. So Lucas was keen to bring back the Holy Grail idea. So in came the Colour Purple screenwriter Menno Meyers, and he penned a draft that explored this. He submitted that at the end of 1986. And it was through Meyers that the idea of Indy being set 3 tests in the movie came about. Even though Spielberg would be heavily involved in what those tests would be, the original genesis for the idea came in at this point. But still, the screenplay wasn't quite there. And so a call this time went into Jeffrey Boehm, who'd had success again penning Inner Space, and he was brought on board. And his process started by working with George Lucas for a couple of weeks just on nailing the story and getting down really the tale that they wanted to tell. Boehm then had something of a balancing job to do, sitting between Spielberg and Lucas. And as much as Lucas was always the architect of the story, Boehm wanted to make it his as well. And he seemed to be getting somewhere with it as well. The story was tighter. It was getting closer and closer to the final movie. And also by this stage, crucially, Spielberg had softened on the idea of the Holy Grail. He was open to them bringing that into the movie. But conversely, he felt that that wasn't enough, that what they needed was some kind of subplot that was, quote, almost strong as the actual Grail itself. And logic dictated that had to be some kind of family tie for the lead character in the movie. And it was around this point, so where are we? About 1987 now, where the father-son idea came into the project. Now, I've read conflicting reports. Some suggest that Steven Spielberg came up with the idea of introducing Indiana Jones's father. Some suggested George Lucas. Whoever it was an absolute eureka moment for the movie, because the bottom line here was that Henry Jones was going to be a part of the movie, that Lucas was interested in the Grail side, Spielberg was interested in the father-son side, and Harrison Ford, crucially too, he liked the idea of his father being brought back in. One of the things that Spielberg also was keen to do was get back to what made the first film work. Again, almost a backtrack about how dark the second movie went. And this involved bringing back some of the characters who'd been excluded from the sequel, Marcus Brody being one of them we've already mentioned. So Henry Jones, the character of Henry Jones, was then worked into assorted drafts done by Menno Meyjes and Jeffrey Boehm. And originally, he was quite a minor part of the movie, that Indy wouldn't discover his father until the end of the film in very early drafts. And in fact, it was Jeffrey Boehm's rewrite that introduced him earlier. He felt that was far more of a beating heartbeat of the story. And this, in turn, took screen time away from other elements, particularly the brother of the cruciform sword, which comes in at the end, but it's a much, much briefer appearance than had originally been planned for the film. The character of Henry Jones, meanwhile, originally the idea there was quite different as well, that the version we got on screen was a marked contrast to the kind of the book-smart professor that had originally been penned into the screenplay. Now, Boehm had been having fun with this script. He'd penned at one point a spin on classic westerns for the opening of the film, with an adult Indy already on the hunt for an artifact. And that was actually working. It was felt to be gelling. But they just kept pushing. They just wanted something a little bit more. And it was around 87-ish that in came the idea of a prologue with a young Indiana Jones, which would bring in the circus elements. If you go back to Chris Columbus and his rhino, bring in all these little bits and bobs there. But it would just be a younger version of the character who would be going on that initial adventure. So Boehm had got the job when Spielberg called him up, and all of his scripts were dated from 1987 onwards, and he would have that really tricky balancing act that Lucas and Spielberg's ideas for these films were slightly different, that they were roughly on the same page, but let's just say at different sides of the same page. Boehm had to capture that, and also had to capture the input of Harrison Ford. I think it's pretty well known that Harrison Ford, as with most movie stars, likes to have input on the story that's being told. Now, on February the 9th, 1987, he officially committed to the movie. He was going to reprise the role for a third film. And by March of 1987, it was definitely going to be the Holy Grail as well. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was the official name of the film, and it was pressing ahead. Now, this had a knock-on effect, in particular for Spielberg, for another film that he'd been juggling making, that he'd spent nearly 6 months developing a movie. Wonder if you've heard of this one, by the name of Rain Man, with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise set to star. And when Indiana Jones The Last Crusade was ready to go, he had to drop that movie, and indeed Barry Levinson would pick it up and would take the film to Oscar Gold. Nonetheless, Indiana Jones would hardly be a consolation prize, and there was still ongoing to and fro about the character of Henry Jones, because it was casting time, and Lucas was said to be veering towards more of a Royal Shakespeare Company style actor for the role, and it was Spielberg who came up with the idea of Sean Connery. Now, Lucas wasn't initially keen on this, because he felt that the audience would look at Sean Connery and they would see James Bond, and Spielberg Spielberg sort of wanted to tap into that a little bit, but also Connery's career was having a little bit of a resurgence because The Untouchables was just happening, the film that would go on to get him his only Academy Award in his career. And Spielberg also assured his old friend Lucas that he'd be able to control Connery on set, that things wouldn't go sour, and that this was a good idea. And so Lucas went along in the end and co-signed off on the casting. So a call went in to Sean Connery, and Connery again was an actor who had ideas and lots of notes, and he met with Lucas and Spielberg. And gone at this point then was the kind of Laurence Olivier type that Lucas had wanted to play Indiana Jones's father. And Ford at this point, Harrison Ford would describe the character evolution now as less Yoda-like, his quote, than originally written. And instead, the tone was shifted so that Henry Jones and Indiana Jones would become more of a match for each other. Now, there was a problem in the casting, that the pair of them were only 12 years apart. And this did cause some consternation. That it also, one of the things that offset it was that Connery saw his version of the Henry Jones character as a bit more action driven than originally written. And there was also the idea of working in a romance for the pair of them with the character of Elsa, that both father and son are fixated on the same woman in the movie. Now, Lucas was not easily convinced of this, because already there was the struggle about they're only 12 years apart, but also was there something just a little bit off, something a little bit creepy about that. But he was persuaded when he saw how the comedic side of it would work, as it does, I'd suggest, play out in the film. There was further casting. River Phoenix was, the late River Phoenix was on the radar to play young Indiana Jones, having appeared just a year or two before with Harrison Ford in the film The Mosquito Coast. That's a really good film. Alison Doody, meanwhile, was brought in as Elsa after going through an audition process, but even after she completed the audition, she was still left waiting for 3 to 4 months to get the good news that she got the role. Julian Glover, well, it's quite handy that he lived next door to the film's producer, Robert Watts. And so he was invited to come in to have a chat about playing a German sergeant in the movie. And he duly went in and had that chat, got a call back the next day asking if he fancied reading for the character of Walter Donovan instead. And he went in, had that conversation, and was duly cast. It sometimes helps to know who your neighbours are, although that's no slight on Julian Glover, who I think is terrific in the movie. Going back to the characters they wanted to bring back as well, both Denham Elliott and John Rhys Davies signed up for a reappearance in the Indiana Jones franchise. And as the movie then headed towards production, scouting would begin on locations in October of 1987, with Spain picked for key sequences, not least because Lawrence of Arabia, a real reference point throughout parts of the development of the movie, had shot in the Almeria area of Spain, which was where Last Crusade was going to go. Tom Stoppard, meanwhile, hugely successful playwright and writer in his own right, was brought in to do uncredited script polish work, as he has done on a collection of Steven Spielberg productions. Sean Connery signed on the dotted line officially to co-star in March of 1988, but he'd been long on board by this point, and the script tweaks had been going on as well. And it got to the point where Indiana Jones was indeed going to return. May 1988 was the official start of production, and everyone was off to Spain. Well, amongst the first people who got there was stuntman and stunt coordinator Vic Armstrong, who in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, he'd taken on a pretty pivotal role. That Harrison Ford had been injured for a good chunk of that production. And so when you watch Temple of Doom, you're actually seeing quite a lot of Vic Armstrong in the role of Indiana Jones. It's just filmed in a way around him, so you don't necessarily see that it's him doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Now, he basically, I mean, he was moving into his own stunts company at this point, and he's written about this in his memoir as well. And in theory, he'd retired from doing movie stunts himself, but he was persuaded out of retirement for Indy 3. Now, just to get into shape to do the movie, never mind Harrison Ford, it took Vic Armstrong 3 months of toning up to do it. And he and his team headed to Spain before main unit filming began, with the first job being to film the tank sequence that appears in the movie. Now, this goes to just some of the logistical challenges of doing stunts on film, because in the movie, I'm going to spoiler light as I can, there is a moment where there are people on horses basically having a chase with people in a tank. Now, the problem there is a tank can only really go about 10 to 12 miles per hour, and a horse can go faster. So how do you train a horse and ride a horse at a speed that looks like in the camera's eye the horse is moving quickly, but also isn't moving as quickly as it can, so it doesn't make the tank look really, really, really slow? Armstrong was faced with that challenge. Mickey Moore was on set and unit duties as well, and they would duly get all of this in the can, and Armstrong and his team would work out how to ride the horse slower but not looking that slow. In fact, a few weeks later, Armstrong would injure himself with one of the moments on the tank where there's a fight that takes place on the tank itself that it didn't quite go to plan. A couple of people picked up injuries in this one. Armstrong, for one, ripped his ligaments. That sounds really nice. He still carried on as his stunt coordinator on the movie, though. It's just the fact is he would need surgery when he got home, even though reading his memoir, it sounded like he needed surgery there and then. Not unreasonably in his book, Armstrong would describe Indiana Jones The Last Crusade as one of the biggest movies he ever worked on. Now, for effects firm Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, the challenges were on set there as well, because this was the era that the computers couldn't do anywhere near the heavy lifting that they do now. So in terms of the practicalities of the visuals they were putting on screen, well, they had to make a Zeppelin airship out of foam, for instance. There's a Luftwaffe fight that takes place in the movie that relied on some real scale planes alongside some blue screen and some miniatures. They were key to that. They also employed, as all of the Indiana Jones films had done to this point, traditional matte paintings for certain effects. So if you look, for instance, at the airport at Berlin, that's a matte painting. There's quite a few examples of it. I think the most infamous matte painting you'll find in the entire saga, though, is the bit at the very, very end of Raiders of the Lost Ark where Indy walks into a warehouse. Again, going to spoil a lie. And I've watched that a couple of times, and that is an insanely detailed painting there. In terms of one particular moment too, where a character meets their end in front of our eyes and basically disintegrates in front of our eyes, Spielberg wanted that to be done in one shot, and that took some physical on-set production work as well as some post-work as well, just to get the kind of melting effect that they needed, and let's just say some puppetry and a half was involved to get that in the can. Now, going back to those tanks, the initial sequences with the tanks actually overran. Now, Spielberg's fairly notable for bringing in the vast majority of his films on time and under budget, but he was having a lot of fun here. The reason the tank sequences overran was they just kept throwing in little ideas and little details to it. Spielberg was enjoying himself, and in fact, he would claim in the Premiere article I mentioned before that he was mellower than he was in the old days on the set of this one, although it's neatly contrasted by, well, Armstrong in the same article just saying that when the boss, when spirituality fails the boss, he will, quote, yell at everything that moves in front of him. There were little bits and tricks just throughout the production of the film. So the scene on the beach with the birds, remember that one? Well, they couldn't use computers. So there's a lot of fake birds that you're seeing on there, as well as some visual effects trickery. They couldn't actually use seagulls because you can't train seagulls to do what they needed to do in the film, so you're looking primarily at white doves. It was also, for the Spain leg of filming, incredibly hot. And Connery and Ford, in fact, would reportedly, I'm grateful to Ian Freer for this anecdote, would go full RoboCop at times. Notably on the set of RoboCop, Peter Weller would only wear half the costume because it was just too hot. So whenever you're seeing shots of Connery and Ford out in the open in Spain, shot from the waist up, let's just say there's a sporting chance that they're not wearing any trousers. Now, things were thankfully a bit cooler when the production then got to London, and everybody could thankfully also put their trousers back on, because the shoot then went to Elstree Studios in June of 1988. Now, as this has been recorded in 2021, the British film industry is buoyant just in terms of production space. That there's been a lot of investment, and we have thriving studio complexes going up around the country. This was not the case towards the end of the 1980s, that the British film industry was in some degree of disarray, and Elstree Studios was one of the structures really that had seen better days. Now, the film would shoot the castle interiors there, and it had housed Temple of Doom, it had housed Raiders of the Lost Ark, but was in some degree of trouble, to the point where executive producer Frank Marshall would send Steven Spielberg to the UK Parliament one day during shooting to plea for subsidies for the studios directly to the Thatcher government of the time, with some degree of success as well. There were other location bits and bobs around the UK, so Oxfordshire doubles for Berlin at one point. You also get the beloved Michael Sheard, the late Michael Sheard, known as Mr. Bronson to a generation of Grange Hill fans, turning up in one of his many times that he played Adolf Hitler on screen. You get moments, let's throw in a few other bits and bobs here as well. There's a sequence fairly early on where rats are used, and these had to be trained rats as well. I didn't know you could train rats, but apparently they were trained rats. But primarily the concern was that rats spread disease, and so the only rats they could use on screen were ones that had been born and bred in a disease-free environment just for film production. The scenes that you see in Venice were initially shot in Essex to keep costs down where they could. But of course, I mean, you can't fool the fact that they do end up in Venice itself for a very brief period, actually, of the production. That they had a day, August the 12th of 1988, they ended up in Venice for one day during tourist season of very intense filming, before the production then went on to Jordan and then over to an assortment of locations in the US into the autumn of 1988. Right throughout this, Ford and Connery were having a ball, and in fact Ford would describe Connery as basically lifting everyone's game. And the film was still evolving as they were shooting. So the motorcycle chase sequence that you get in the movie wasn't actually in the script. That was added fairly late in production. That Spielberg had realised while making the movie that The Last Crusade was turning into something of a chase film, and so he wanted a more direct chase sequence, and that motorcycle sequence that you get was shot near San Francisco in the end. In fact, I think he did a sequence in his Tintin movie that came out 2011, which I think quite closely mirrors the style and feel of that as well. I think that's worth digging out if you've not had a chance to have a look at it. Now, filming the last shots would end up in the can in early 1989, and in theory, that was it. The end of the Indiana Jones trilogy. As Frank Marshall would tell Premiere, that they got a moment of 11th hour luck with a sunset in Texas to give them the last shot of everyone riding off into the sunset. And that was that. Physical production was at an end, in theory, for the last time in an Indiana Jones film. It didn't pan out that way, of course, but that was the thinking at the point Last Crusade wrapped. Now, even by the time that last shot was in the can, the film's promotion had begun, because this movie was a big deal. This was Spielberg back in family movie mode for the first time in half a decade. It was a big sequel, and the trailer was sent into cinemas in November of 1988, so a good 6-7 months before the film came out, at a point where that wasn't a common tactic. But what was interesting about the trailer was it wasn't a packaged together trailer of footage for the film. It included shots of Spielberg directing. It was almost like a little behind the scenes peek as much as anything else, to tease the fact that here we are, we're out and about, we're making this new Indiana Jones film. It was coupled with a poster saying the man with the hat is back, and this time he's bringing his dad. And in fact, that trailer trick would be repeated when Spielberg made his next family movie, Hook, although I would suggest at that point it was a little bit less effective. the release date was coming into sharp focus. It was coming out in the US, this film, in May of 1989, and there was a fair amount of post-production work to do. ILM in particular was facing some real challenges here, and about the hardest shot that it had to put together was a leap of faith that takes place relatively late in the movie, that involved rocks being painted to reflect what was below. As Michael McAllister, the ILM effects supervisor, said, nobody really knew how to do it. And if you've seen the film, you'll know the bit that I mean. And when you watch that sequence again, it throws in a collection of techniques, a matte painting, and a miniature set of the physical bridge, as well as some the aforementioned painting of things, just to give them some degree of camouflage. Now, John Williams, he would be back to do the score. He would rely, interestingly, less on the main Indiana Jones themes for this as well. I think it's a delightful score to The Last Crusade. He would put that score together and record it in January, February 1989. And the feeling was, and this goes back to the article that I mentioned in Premiere's June 1989 issue, that this was it. That there was an original agreement right at the start in 1981, just after Raiders had come out, between Lucas and Spielberg, that Spielberg had shook Lucas's hand and agreed to make this a trilogy. And the film's editor, Michael Kahn, he captured that when he told Premiere, you understand how emotional this is for all of us, as he locked the picture down, because this was the end of an era. It wasn't the end of an era, but it felt like the end of an era. The film was locked in early April of 1989, and it was ready for its release. Now, I think Indiana Jones The Last Crusade is revered as a much loved movie now, not least for the likes of Sean Connery. I mean, the moment where he goes, I lost him, just completely broke my heart. It's one of a couple of moments, really moving moments in the movie. But it's easy to overlook the fact that the reviews of this one, when it first came out, they were far more mixed than you might expect. That there was pushback again, as much as it was regarded as a lot of fun. It did get positive reviews. There was pushback that it was a little bit flabbier, and also I've read one or two things that suggest that Spielberg slightly lost control of this one, that he never fully got on top of the Connery and Harrison Ford moments, that they kind of went on a little bit. Now, I disagree with that, but I just think it's important just to contrast the fact of how revered the movie is now compared to how well it was received at the time. Well, that's by critics anyway, because by the time it actually made it to cinemas, well, the response was pretty much ecstatic. It came out in the Memorial Weekend in the US, so at the end of May 1989. It shot to number one with a record-breaking weekend, and this was just before Batman would completely rewrite box office records just a little while later. It opened at number one with $37 million over a long weekend. And it's really interesting just to look at the other films that were in the top 10. Rain Man was there, for instance, but the number two was See No Evil, Hear No Evil with Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder. The Peerless Field of Dreams was in at number 3. Patrick Swayze in Roadhouse at 4. Clint Eastwood in Pink Cadillac at 5. K-9 at 6. K-9. Pet Sematary, Major League, Scandal. They were all in the top 10, with Beaches just hovering just below as well. And Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade would go on to be a monstrous hit. It had cost, around $48 million to make. It would go on to gross worldwide. Well, the total came in at $474 million. And then on top of that, you've got videos, DVDs. A new 4K issue is coming up shortly as well at the time this has been recorded. Ford, Lucas and Spielberg didn't take upfront salaries for this one, so they took a healthy slice of that gross. And exclusively, I can reveal that I didn't. Hence, I'm there and they're living all in posh houses. All power to them. Now, this was to be the end of Indiana Jones. And in fact, this was the first film where Spielberg pretty much just went and made another film back to back, something he'd repeat a few years later. In this case, he would do the film Always, one of his quieter movies, and then it would spark a couple of commercial projects. He'd go on to do Hook, and then he would do some weird thing about dinosaurs. Who thought that would catch on? For 1993, before his career took something of an about turn when he made that back to back with Schindler's List. Lucas would go on to do some smaller experimental stuff again. He made Radioland Murders and hired British comedy star and director Mel Smith to helm that one. But the questions kept coming for them. Will there be an Indiana Jones 4? Will there be an Indiana Jones 4? And the answer for a long time was no, until eventually it was yes. But that is a story for another time. Which all brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. I am an independent, it's a small favour time really. I'm an independent podcast producer. I'm a nerd sat in a room without a company behind me or anything like that. I've got this far purely off the back of your support really, be that on Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew, or subscribing to this podcast or leaving ideally a hugely positive review, and thus all the algorithms out there in the world recommend other people to listen to this podcast and suffer my inane warblings. I can't thank you enough for all the support you've given me, and it's legitimately you and your recommendations that have got me thus far. If you could spare one, I would be hugely grateful. I will, though, stop waffling on about trying to get you to do things. I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this podcast. We're going back to 1998 this time. I think this is a smashing movie. Let me play you a clip first, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
I suppose the biggest name I ever met was Monroe.
Marilyn?
Met. You remember him? The singing bus conductor. No? You like Marilyn, yeah?
Yeah.
Can you do her as well? Go on. I'll bet you can. Oh, there you go.
I have this thing about saxophone players. I don't know what it is. My spine turns to custard. I get goosebumpy all over.
Frick me. That's amazing. Christ, I don't believe that.
That then was a clip from 1998's Little Voice, directed by Mark Herman from his screenplay as well, based on the play The Rise and Fall of Little Voice by Jim Cartwright. The cast led by, well, you heard Jane Horrocks and Michael Caine there, as well as Brenda Blethyn's in the movie, Jim Broadbent and Ewan McGregor. And the story of this one goes back to 1992, which was when Jim Cartwright's play debuted for the first time. It debuted at the Royal National Theatre in London, and what Cartwright had done is he'd written this particular play around the extraordinary talents of its lead actor, the brilliant Jane Horrocks. Now, Horrocks had this incredible ability to take on the voices and style of legendary figures from film and from music, the likes of Judy Garland, Shirley Bassey, Marilyn Monroe, and Cartwright became aware of this and wrote the production around her. It was written especially for her. It was also a success that The Rise and Fall of Little Voice won the Laurence Olivier Award for Best New Comedy back in 1992. And the original production of the movie, which would transfer to the West End and to Broadway, was directed by someone called, well, Sam Mendes. Now, Sam Mendes, at this stage, he hadn't directed any James Bond films, he hadn't won any Oscars, he hadn't done a war movie in pretty much one single shot, in theory. But at this point, he was an acclaimed theatre director even. He had a reputation and a half for his stage work, and the idea came to perhaps take the story of Little Voice to the big screen. And Sam Mendes was interested. This was going to be the film to be his feature directorial debut, and indeed he'd develop it for a while. He would write a screenplay adaptation himself before another opportunity presented itself. Would he like to go and make for DreamWorks Pictures a film called American Beauty? And turns out that's just what he wanted to do. And he would direct that movie with Kevin Spacey in the lead. He would take home a Best Director Oscar for his trouble. The film would win Best Picture and would be a huge international hit. So you can't say he necessarily made a particularly poor choice there. But for Little Voice, well, it needed a new director. Now, it was producer Elizabeth Carlson who came up with the idea of Mark Herman. Now, Herman had had an adventure in Hollywood with the Dudley Moore headline Blame It on the Bellboy that he'd written, which hadn't gone down particularly well. And he's given a couple of interesting interviews where he talked about when he stopped trying to chase a hit, that's when he got success. And he made the 1996 film Brassed Off that I've covered before and I absolutely adore. If you've not seen Brassed Off, I do urge you to seek it out. Now, Brassed Off was a film that had been a hit in the UK. It had had some success in America as well. It had the support of Miramax at the point where that was still being headed up by convicted rapist Harvey Weinstein. And Miramax had been happy with Brassed Off. It was a British film set in the north of England. It was nice and gritty, and they could sell that and did sell that. So when it came time to sound out a new director for Little Voice, well, as Mark Herman said, he told IndieWire, I suppose with Brassed Off dealing with northern grit and music and all that, I was perhaps naturally on Harvey Weinstein's list of possible replacements. Now, by the time an offer went into Mark Herman to see if he was interested in directing the film, a couple of people had already taken a stab at the screenplay, that Jim Cartwright had done an adaptation of it himself, and then Sam Mendes had also written his take on the movie. But for Herman, when he read these drafts, what he felt was it wasn't a film, that it hadn't really fully captured the cinema, that it didn't escape the stage roots of the story. I think we've seen lots of films between us all where it's an adaptation of a stage play on film, and it still sort of looks like a stage play. And I got the sense from Herman's interviews that he felt it was still captured in that a little bit. So conditional on him taking on the director's chair was him wanting to take a pass himself at the script. Now, there was a further condition as well, because there were rumours that when Miramax was looking to back the movie, it wasn't particularly keen on Jane Horrocks for the role. Quite who it felt could step into the role is anyone's guess. But from Miramax's point of view, she wasn't a well-known movie star. And from Jane Horrocks' point of view, she didn't want to be a well-known movie star. She's given interviews to this to that topic in the past. Now, she got some profile in the US for being part of the absolutely fabulous ensemble. She'd appeared in films. I mean, she's brilliant in Mike Leigh's Life is Sweet. But Miramax at this point was rumoured to want to change the entire setting of Little Voice to America and bring in an American cast. Herman had actually seen the play, and in his words, he, quote, couldn't quite get a grasp on that. And so, from his point of view, if he was going to do this, not only would he want to have a go at the script, it had to be in the UK, it had to be Jane Horrocks. How could this possibly work without the person it was written around? Now, that's not to say when Herman came in and did rewrite work, he wasn't willing to make some fairly sizable changes. He brought in a whole new character for a start, the character of Billy, as played by Ewan McGregor in the movie. Now, Herman had worked with McGregor on Brassed Off, and McGregor then went off to do a small movie with George Lucas by the name of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. But what Herman also did was he slightly relocated the film, because he'd done one movie that was set in the north and played to the industrial towns of the north. And originally that's where Little Voice was set as well. And he said, I thought we should do something different. So we chose this place. He's explaining this to an American outlet at the moment, IndieWire, called Scarborough. And Scarborough is in the north of England, but it's a seaside holiday resort. And he argues it adds another character to the film. Well, more than that, I'd suggest, because it also added another name to the film as well. Because Herman was reportedly on his second or third draft of the screenplay for Little Voice when he chose Scarborough as the location for it. And that's when the name of Michael Caine came into the frame. Because Herman felt naturally that if it was a film set in an industrial town, people wouldn't necessarily buy Michael Caine in the role of Ray Sway, the manager of music acts. They wouldn't believe that he'd washed up from London to an industrial town in the north of England, but someone from London washing up in a seaside town, well, that had something a bit more believable about it. Now, there's a story that Pete Postlethwaite had been sounded out about playing Ray Sway. Pete Postlethwaite had appeared for Mark Herman in Brassed Off, of course. But Postlethwaite, at this point anyway, was off filming Jurassic Park 2, or The Lost World Jurassic Park, for Steven Spielberg. I've talked about him in this podcast already. And so he wasn't an option anyway. But with Caine aboard, the role of Ray Sway was then also expanded slightly as well and written a bit more around him. Kane, in fact, briefly touches on the film in his second memoir, noting how he came to this one off the back of making a Harry Palmer sequel that hadn't worked. And then he did Little Voice in a film called The Cider House Rules back to back, basically taking risks on more challenging roles, and then found that really paid off. Before production began, there was still the issue of script notes coming in from Miramax. In particular, there were the jokes read by the compere, Mr. Boo, played by Jim Broadbent in the movie, that Miramax was arguing that the jokes that he was telling weren't funny, and Herman had to argue back. That was the point. Nonetheless, this whole thing was getting somewhere. Brenda Blethyn came in to join the quite small ensemble for the movie, and by October 1997, the small budget was in place and Little Voice was pressing forward. That it was Buena Vista Distribution and Miramax Films were coming together on this one, and the movie was a go. The filming necessarily took place in off-season in Scarborough, that they knew they couldn't film in a seaside town when all the tourists were around, but Herman also liked basically the vibe and the tone of the seaside town when the tourists had pretty much abandoned it until the following summer. For Ewan McGregor, he came in to warm autumn Scarborough. I think it was quite the opposite of that, straight from making The Phantom Menace. And as Mark Herman told me in an interview I did with him quite a while ago, he said, I think McGregor loved the change. I think after the hectic time he'd had over there, the notion of sitting in a pub in an off-season seaside resort and occasionally doing a bit of acting with someone like Jane Horrocks was a bit of a godsend for him. Well, Jane Horrocks was also the trump card of the film because her low profile really worked to the element of surprise that's contained within it. That few people, with no disrespect to her, I think she's brilliant, few people look at her and think that she's going to be able to sing all these songs in quite the manner that she does. I really think it's extraordinary what she does. And when it came time to film a key live performance segment of the movie, Herman sort of bottled that a little bit because he wanted Horrocks to do it for real, understandably for a start. And so this was the moment where 500 extras were brought in for the audience, but Herman purposely didn't tell them quite what was going to happen. I think they'd managed to piece together that they were going to sit and listen to some musical performance, but what they didn't know was quite who was going to walk out in front of them and quite what they were going to do. And as Herman told IndieWire, when she walked out and sung, we hadn't told the audience what was going to happen. And he said, that day I thought we got something really special. And in fact, he talked about the production of Little Voice as saying there were moments in the shooting of the film when you felt something special was happening. He would describe this as really quite magical in places. Inevitably, given the nature of the movie, there wasn't an awful lot of ad-libbing on this one. Jim Broadbent apparently had a go at ad-libbing certain bits for his compere, Mr. Boo, but many of his jokes were cut out in the end. And Kane, meanwhile, well, there was a bit of a tense moment for him because this would be the first time he would be singing on film since his infamous turn in the wonderful The Muppet Christmas Carol all the way back in 1992. Now, Kane was apparently quite nervous about this, but to his credit, and as Herman tells, he just went for it. And he did a couple of goes of his big singing sequence, which I'm not going to spoil for you if you don't know it, and it was duly in the can. The film, and it's worth noting, Annette Badland and Philip Jackson also ran the cast of this one, came together and it went into post-production where Herman told IndieWire a little bit of his process about how he liked to test cuts of his films at the end of each week of post-production. But crucially, he didn't test these cuts with people in the business. He explicitly sought out friends who weren't in the film business, surrounded himself with honest people who could call it pretty much as it is. And he knew early on in the putting together of the final cut of Little Voice that he had something here. He knew from the responses he was getting he was onto something, that people were being really sideswiped by the movie itself. I'm going spoiler light. I do think it's an absolute delight of a film. And then he talked about how more polish was added, as it always is in post-production, how the music came in, and he just felt the film was getting better. Before a full test audience, though, there was a degree of pushback centred on Brenda Blethyn's accent in the movie. She plays Mary Hoff in the film, and her accent was deemed to be thick, so thick to the point of people couldn't necessarily understand what she was saying. This was particularly when it was tested in America. And thus she was brought back to re-record all her dialogue, and the accent softened, and the film went out to a test audience again, and the test audience could understand her this time, but they liked the film less. What Herman realised was that when people understood every word she was saying, it tested worse. That the more people understood her, the less they liked the character. And part of the point of the character, he felt, was that the accent is a bit impenetrable. There is something just a little bit intimidating about it, I think. And so they reverted back to the audio that they captured on the actual shoot of the movie. Now, surprisingly, perhaps with this one, for what's basically ostensibly a British movie, even though it had a good chunk of American money in it, the film debuted in America first. And inevitably, this was a small release. It was a low-budget film. And so it did the film festival circuit for a while. That it actually debuted in September 1998 at the Toronto International Film Festival. It played the Chicago Film Festival. It did get its UK debut at the London Film Festival in November of 1998. But in terms of a wide theatrical release, well, it was put out in cinemas in the US on the 4th of December 1998 and wouldn't land in the UK until a year later. That said, there was some awards jiggery-pokery going on there, that to qualify for an Oscar run in the US, the film had to be out before the end of 1998. Hence, that probably, I'd suggest, explains the slightly earlier release date. It certainly didn't set the box office alight. I don't think anyone massively expected it to set the box office alight, but nonetheless, it got some good reviews. I mean, there was a little bit of pushback on the film, but there was pretty much unanimous praise for the performances in it. I mean, Jane Horrocks in particular pretty much brought the house down, reading some of the reviews now. But also there was praise too for the work of Brenda Blethyn in the movie and Michael Caine in the movie as well. And the film, when it opened in the US, it made a minor box office ripple. I don't think much more than that it came out that weekend, December the 4th, 1998, and it was just a busy period at the box office. This is going into high season at this point, and if we look at the other movies that were around at this point, the big opener the week it was out was A Bug's Life. It wasn't even the opener, that was on its third week, and was still bringing lots of money. Enemy of the State was in the charts. There were competitors really in the shape of the Rugrats movie. The Psycho remake had opened at number 2 with $10 million, and way down the chart, opening just on 6 screens and thus qualifying for its awards run, was Little Voice, which opened in 17th place, $93,000, on its way to around $4.5 million worldwide. But also when it came to the UK, this would be a much more notable hit, and perhaps inevitably it would find more success. It would also find that it would replicate that feeling of surprise, because come the release, it was still the subset of the audience. In fact, I guess it's not a subset. The majority of the audience, I'd suggest, didn't know it was Horrocks doing the singing. And it got to the point where Herman spotted this in post-production, and he knew this was going to be a thing. So he deliberately put a credit at the end of the movie that just told people that what you've actually watched is Jane Horrocks doing it for real. And perhaps unsurprisingly, 2 excellent soundtrack albums would follow for the movie. The movie too would find itself in awards contention. Now, Michael Caine, there's a lovely chat, a lovely interview with Mark Herman where he talks about this. Michael Caine would find himself in Oscar contention, but Caine opted to try for Best Actor rather than Best Supporting Actor for the movie, because his argument at that point was reportedly he'd already won a Best Supporting Actor Oscar for Hannah and Her Sisters a few years later, and he didn't need another one. And Herman told me that he just reckoned Caine probably squeezed himself out there, whereas the Best Supporting Actor winner that year was James Coburn for the film Affliction. Excellent performance, but quite a low-key one, and he just wondered if Caine would have a better chance there. Brenda Blethyn got an Oscar nod though, and Michael Caine picked up a Golden Globe, and also there was some awards attention for Jane Horrocks, although that came from the BAFTAs and came from the Golden Globes, and the film was left with a single Academy Award nomination. But also it was left with quite a lovely legacy to it. It's one of those films that just keeps bobbling up and keeps being discovered, and the music as well from it keeps being discovered. And in fact, more recently, the story of Little Voice has been picked up by Miramax TV, now no longer linked in any way to Harvey Weinstein, to be clear, which early in 2021 announced that Jim Cartwright was now adapting his stage play for a new TV production based in and around the story of Little Voice. It's not the easiest film to track down, this, but I do think it is an uplifting delight, and Jane Horrocks in it, I mean, it is just a case of just take a bow. What Herman was talking about of seeing the magic when he was making the film, yeah, I can utterly see what he was on about. Which all brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. You can get more of my waffling, if you could suffer any more, on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod on Twitter. If you go to our website, filmstories.co.uk, well, we've just announced our move into physical media. We're putting out in the UK a Blu-ray of Sneakers. You can find out a bit more about that there. And on the website as well, we've got every weekday we update with news, with reviews, with movie nerdisms, with features, all sorts of bits and bobs. We have a store where you can buy all of our print magazines, and there are 30 to choose from now. That's at store.filmstories.co.uk. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, and you can find a bit more on YouTube too at youtube.com/filmstories. And then one more thing I was doing before the pandemic hit, and I hope you're all safe and well, live shows in and around the UK. Those are now due to return in the summer of 2021. Again, you can find more about those as they're announced at filmstories.co.uk. For now, though, I'm going to shut up and leave you in peace. I waffled on far too much. As always, I hugely appreciate your support. I hugely appreciate your ears. Most important thing is you all take care and you be well. I'll be back soon with some more Film Stories. Bye-bye.
We named the dog Indiana.
May we go home now, please?
The dog? You are named after the dog?